Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear Jessica, thank you very much for your kindly introduction. I would like to begin today's presentation by giving you a glimpse into the life of a man called Johann Heinrich Dirksen. He was born in the year 1897 to a prosperous farming family from the southern periphery of the withering Tsarist Empire. At the age of 10, he was forced to become a full-fledged man after the death of his parents, just before the outbreak of World War I. This war brought about dramatic and tragic changes in the history of the Mennonites, and Johann's home colony was no exception. Perhaps if there hadn't been a war, a revolution, and then a civil war, the Mennonites from Gnadenfeld on the Molochna River would have had a real chance to live a strenuous yet happy life, since the community where Johann lived until 1920 was well known for their advanced social system. It is even possible to imagine that young Johann and his siblings could have received the necessary support from the community to work their father's land independently, for they had plenty of it. Dirksen's father owned about 400 hectares of land. After the civil war in the steppe near the Black Sea had ended, it turned out that the inheritance Dirksen's father left behind was actually not a secure foundation, but rather a threat to his life. In the eyes of new regime, a family like this was clearly made out of exploiters of the working class, and they were duly persecuted. The newly established Soviet state discriminated consistently against people with such social background as Dirksen, and they were often confronted with massive restrictions of their rights. This dangerous social background was probably the reason why Johann tried to deny, conceal, and eventually change his identity in the early 1920s. After serving in the military, he succeeded in obtaining a good documents. This means that he took on a different identity, one against which Bolsheviks would never know objections. And so the Mennonite Johann Heinrichovich Dirksen became the Ukrainian Nikolai Abramovich Pikolenko. At that time, Johann left his home colony and began his new life in the northern part of Ukraine, hundreds of miles away from Gnadenfeld on Molochna River. Thus far, I have tried to present the most salient elements of this man's life. As you can see from the list, the year 1934 brought about another profound change in Dirksen's biography. This year saw plenty of dramatic changes in Soviet history as well. An important one was the creation of the People Commissioner of the Internal Affairs, NKVD, which a few years later, under Stalin, unleashed the Great Terror that made of ethnic and denominational groups, including Mennonites, the target of persecution. It is possible that Dirksen quit his position with the local militia precisely during this year because he feared being exposed by his false identity during the upcoming personal review. The next turning point to his life came in 1941, when the German Wehrmacht invaded the city of Preluki. Dirksen Pikolenko put himself immediately at the service of the occupiers, and many in his neighborhood were surprised to hear him speak German for the first time. Could the service to the Nazis mean a long-awaited recovery or regaining of this identity, of his identity? To a certain extent, it probably did. He was finally able to speak his mother tongue again after a break of many years. However, if you look at it as a liberation from his inner escape, it was most definitely not, because those who liberated him also gave him the routine tasks of translating list of Jews and other enemies of the German people. The persistent threat of the Soviet state's willingness to use violence, especially against those social and ethnic group which classified as hostile, not only led to resistance from these persecuted groups, it also brought about a wide variety of adaptation strategies. People tried to deny any relationship to the so-called anti-Soviet group, avoided drawing any attention to themselves, and stayed out of the way of the state apparatus wherever possible. Dirksen Pikolenko's case is an exceptional one. Clearly, not every Mennonite changed their identity in such a decisive way. Nevertheless, Dirksen and his rather unusual biography embody the zeitgeist of the 1930s and 1940s, a time when adaptation in its various forms and loyalty demonstration became the most important condition for survival. The mobility and adaptation skills that we find in the history of men, such as Dirksen, can be seen as crucial traits, survival skills, if you will, for those who were often forced to switch sides back and forth between two totalitarian regimes. Hopefully, I have been able to convey a first impression of the kind of sources I am working with on my current project. To give you a sense what I am currently doing, my researching project focuses on the different forms of collaboration between the German settlers, to which the Mennonites are a part of according to old German research tradition, and the occupational administration in Ukraine from 1941 to 1944. The main sources I am working with are part of the recently opened collections of files of the former KGB archives. For the larger part, they are investigative files on persons of German and Mennonite origin who were accused of collaborating with the German occupying forces. The documents relate to war crimes committed during the war and deal with cases that were usually brought to justice. In addition, these KGB files also contain other types of documents, like correspondence, observation reports, statistics, etc. Some of these collections are also relevant for our work, particularly those dealing with specific topics such as Nazi institutions or organizations in the occupied territories. These collections dealing with certain subject, so-called literные дела, often contain excerpts from documents to which the original no longer exist or are in archives to which access remains limited or closed, as is the case, for example, in some other countries of the former Soviet Union. That's why these sources are also usually they helpful. The advantages of investigative files, следственные дела, like these, which extensively documents the life of certain individual for longer period of time before and after the war, are evident. They allow us to trace the life story of individuals, sometimes over decades, and to place them in the historical context. However, the limitation pertaining to these documents and their usefulness as reliable sources are not to be underestimated. Reasonable doubts have been clearly stated about the historical value and their credibility. Anyone who is slightly familiar with the history of the Soviet judicial system will want to pay close attention to and be cautious with the information, if any at all, that can be obtained from these sources. The trustworthiness of testimonies of certain witnesses or defendants can rapidly fade when some dozens of pages later you read in the same file that interrogation protocols were forged by the investigator and that the testimonies were caused through the use of physical violence. Examples like this abound, including ones that deal with some alleged collaborators and criminals of Mennonite origin. For example, Isaac Kramer, major of Kichkas on Kortica, in the year 1941, recorded a statement during the spring of 1946, where he said, during the interrogation that took place on February 23rd, 1945, I was persistently asked through physical force to expose the German agents known to me. Isaac Kramer formally denounced the beating during those interrogations and stated that the most important deponent against him was a rubber hose, Gummischlauch, with which he was consistently beaten. In the time during the war and the years right after the war, investigations about the so-called traitors were oversimplified and accelerated. Today, this means that there are many poorly documented investigations and military trials. However, and still under these conditions, the records obtained from the KGB and other governmental bodies in the time are available historical sources. While they are by no means suitable to determine a person's guilt or innocence, these documents contain a wealth of information about life in occupied Ukraine that just can't be found elsewhere. This is the reason why I believe that these files can be used provided that one is aware of their shortcomings and particular nature. To show you what I mean, I would like to demonstrate how I conduct my work with these sources by way of two case studies which are, of course, directly related to the subject of our conference. When the Nazis established their cooperation scheme with the so-called native Germans, Volksdeutsche, living in Ukraine, they took advantage of skill that interpreters, teachers, or medical staff could provide. One such character was Ivan Klassen, a man born in the village of Shestakovka in the Stalin area, today Donetsk. After his medical studies, he was sent to the hospital in his father's birth city Molochansk, formerly called Halbstadt, where he worked as a doctor and taught courses for the hospital medical staff. By the time he was 33, he had already become chief physician. Around the same time World War II has broken out, in autumn 1943, Klassen was evacuated by the Nazis, and with his parents and siblings, he was sent to Germany, where he was arrested by Smersh, Soviet intelligence anti-spy units, 2 years later. He was then transferred to the city of Zaporozhye, where he allegedly committed his crime. In November 1945, Klassen stood before the military tribunal, was sentenced to death, and shot on January 17, 1946. So, what were the accusations against Klassen? In addition to the charges that most Mennonite and Germans from the Soviet Union were incriminated with, for example, receiving privileged status for being native German, Volksdeutsche, foreign travels outside of the USSR, and taken on foreign citizenship, which according to the criminal court of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was considered to be high treason, Ivan Ivanovich Klassen was charged with several aggravated felonies. Among them was his work in the so-called SS hospital, negligent treatment, for example, malpractice of wounded soldiers and officers of Red Army, and finally, he was investigated and accused of segregating and classifying groups of disabled children and elderly as unfit to work. These people were patients of two homes in colony of Orlov, a village close to Halbstadt on the Molochna River, and their segregation ultimately resulted in their execution by an SS command. Let us take a closer look at this final accusation. Sometime in November 1941, Klassen received a direct order from an SD officer in Molotchansk, SS Lieutenant Wenzel, to go with him to Orlov and conduct an examination in the homes for disabled children and adults. He was sent to inspect patients and attest to their ability to walk. Although Klassen was not officially informed about the actual purpose of this examination, any remark made by Wenzel on the way about the resettlement of those defined as unfit was probably enough to understand that he was being used to plan and carry out the liquidation of these people. At that time, he was sent to do the inspection. Not even a month has passed since the Wehrmacht had seized control of Halbstadt. However, Ivan Klassen was well aware of the Nazi jargon. These so-called relocations or resettlements were a code name often for planned shootings. It is safe to assume that he was not completely ignorant to this fact due to his familiarity with SS Obersturmbannführer or Captain Heinrich Wiens, with whom he attended school in Molotchansk in the 1920s. Wiens left Ukraine sometime around 1927 or 1928 and returned to his homeland in 1941 as a committed Nazi and as a commander of a destruction squad. The old Mennonite colony of Orlov was home to about 200 disabled people. There were close to 100 disabled children aged 6 to 14 and about the same number of physically challenged elderly divided in two homes. A week after Dr. Klassen has visited and inspected the homes to attest to the people's ability to walk, about half of them were executed by that SS commander. Since the investigations against him began, Klassen confessed to his role and his participation in the allegations against him. Moreover, he admitted to knowing from the onset what the fate of those he declared incapable of walking would end up being. According to his statements and to some testimonies from witnesses, not all patients were examined by Klassen. The medical examination itself was a mere formality. The only thing that Klassen argued during the investigation was the claim of witnesses that he himself put the markings on the patient list. During his trial, Ivan Klassen expressed to the court his remorse about the crime he committed and mentioned this very episode of the homes for the disabled in Orlov. He declared, "I confess that I am guilty of annihilating disabled people, for they were executed after my examination. I consider my actions to be profoundly serious, but back then I could not have done otherwise, because at any given moment I was on the verge of being arrested." While investigators were confronted with contradictory statements on some other charges, the episode in Orlov seems to have been rather plausible. It is noteworthy to mention that the courts assessed his case quite differently. It was not very common to hear about interpreters or other qualified personnel collaborating with Nazi being accused of directly participating in the executions. In the case of Ivan Klassen, his relationship to several known war criminals, such as earlier mentioned Captain Heinrich Wiens, and to some other SS men, is what ultimately became his doom. An important discovery to this end was the fact that investigators found out that Heinrich Himmler had visited the hospital on his journey through Molochna settlements during the autumn 1944 and had become rather fond of Ivan Klassen. After this, not even his long-standing work as an informant for the Soviet secret police could have helped him escape the highest punishment. I need a couple of minutes now. Further, the annihilation of disabled patients, to which Klassen was an essential accomplice, was part of the SS plan to establish a support colony, a Stutz colony, and with the ethnically clean population in the Molochna settlements. To conclude my presentation, I would like to briefly address the most numerous group of workers employed by the occupying forces, the Soviet German-speaking civilians, which became interpreters and translators. They conducted work for the military task forces, police, and so weiter, etc. The members of this group differed greatly in their condition and also in terms of age, education, denomination, and origin, just as their work assignments did. Thus, the analysis of a group, of a whole group, is a real challenge. For my research, I have decided to take a closer look just at the work and life of translators and interpreters in a single Nazi authority from a certain territory. For several reasons, I decided to study SS and SD task forces Einsatzkommandos in the Crimea. First, the SS and SD Einsatzkommandos were the ones responsible for the implementation of the Nazi genocide policy. Second, the SS leaders designed and carried out the mobile forces responsible for supporting and protecting the ethnic Germans in the occupied territories. As a result, the settlements of Mennonites by the Molochna River were within the competence of the Crimean SS and SD staff stationed in Simferopol, in the capital of the Crimea Peninsula. An initial analysis of the documentary of the SD headquarters on the peninsula Crimea shows that every fourth or fifth native interpreter, translator, out of 25-30 in total, was a Mennonite origin. These resources show that some other Mennonites served also in the SD branches established in smaller towns on the peninsula. Given that we are in the early stages of our investigation, we still know very little of this periphery group. Apparently, one member of this group was a man called Rudolf Federau, allegedly of Mennonite origin, who became known for his atrocities in the Crimean SD. He worked as a school headmaster during the Soviet era, and just a few weeks after the occupation started, he was appointed Major of Halbstadt. After this, he served as a translator for the SD in Crimea. He was known to be an effective agent and agitator. He was also known as feared among the civilian population for robbery, murder, and rape. After a short trial, he was shot by his superiors. Now going back to the interpreters, and another minute, please, to the interpreters and translators. Given that after the deportation that took place in August 1941, there were practically no more ethnic Germans in Crimea, the NS administration was forced to look for skilled labor in the Molochna settlements or those from the North Caucasus. Both of these regions are known to be historical Mennonite settlement regions. From a total of six Mennonite translators that we could identify, most were employed by the investigation department. Their main task was to find and eliminate the Jews and other enemies of the German people. On average, each of them served the SS and SD for about 2 years and participated in more than 500 interrogations, many of which ended in execution. Among their daily tasks was the translation and preparation of list of Jews and Soviet activists for their liquidation. From their multiple statements and testimonies, we know that the appropriation of Jewish goods and property after their execution was largely tolerated. Among translators and entrepreneurs, including Mennonites, it was no different. One such case was that Elizabeth Johnson, an inhabitant of Simferopol who worked in the store where the authorities kept the clothes and personal belongings of the Jews sent to be executed. These items were to be distributed among ethnic Germans, primarily in the Molochny region. For Johnson, it was not enough to have the first choice with the clothing, where she could pick the best ones for her. She also moved into one of the apartments that became free after the execution. This, notwithstanding, her colleagues characterized Johnson as a modest and calm person. At least 2 other Mennonite interpreters from Simferopol moved into fully equipped apartments of Jews after several thousand of them were shot dead on the outskirts of the city of December 1941. Incidentally, both Heinrich Winz and allegedly Rudolf Federau participated on these mass shootings. The last sentence, the only on whose behavior regarding the appropriation of Jewish property was criticized from her colleagues was an interpreter called Maria Epp from the vicinity of Melitopol. Many thought things were going too far when she, along with SD supervisor Temple, started snatching goods from the homes of the arrested Jews, often even before their fate was decided. Apparently, Maria Epp had many suitcases full of Jewish clothes in her office as their headquarters and never hesitated to show her colleagues some Jewish stuff. Thank you for your attention and for your Verständnis. Danke.